It's that time of the year again. Fresh notebooks, new classes, and the smell of fall leaves in the air. September is all about new beginnings, and just like a new semester brings fresh energy, the SDG Warriors podcast is back after its own summer break. I'm Simar Mohanty, the team lead and student coordinator of the SDG Warriors. We're a team of passionate student changemakers and STEMnists on a mission to meet the UN SDGs by 2030, leveraging the power of STEM education and the 21st century skills. This podcast features inspiring stories from edu heroes and STEM experts from around the world, ideal for students, teachers, parents, and pretty much anybody who's interested in STEM education and social impact. This podcast aims to provide enriching learning experiences and drive positive change in local, global, and digital community. Now, today on National Wildlife Day, we are going to be in conversation with someone who's using wings of survival to rewild our minds, blending extreme sport and ecological science to celebrate and safeguard the resilience of wildlife. Please welcome Dr. Timm Döbert, who is a conservation scientist, explorer, and endurance athlete, and the co founder of Wings of Survival, a visionary initiative using self powered expeditions, citizen science, and storytelling to promote the protection of 30% of the planet by 2030. And as an active contributor to the IUCN's Commission on Education and Communication, Timm has conducted groundbreaking research on forest fragmentation in Southeast Asia and grassland ecosystems in Canada. And now he's preparing for his ultra endurance expeditions, tracing the migratory patterns of birds. Like migratory birds finding their way home, we are so glad you have landed here with us today, Timm.
Well, thank you so much for having me on this beautiful introduction.
Thank you so much. And before we dive into today's conversation, to help our listeners audibly visualize the entire experience, can you tell us where are you located? What's the weather like outside? And what can you see from your window right now?
Right. So I'm based in Edmonton, in Canada. So that's Western Canada. It's about 5 hours away from the Rocky Mountains. It's sort of a grassland region, I would say. And the weather's actually smoky, I have to say. So that's the bad news. So I woke up this morning, just kind of sensing fire smoke. So unfortunately, in Canada, increasingly we get forest fires in places where naturally they wouldn't occur. So it's a nice day, generally speaking. It's warm and sunny, but again, we've got the smoke in the air. So that's the spoiler. But I guess that relates to some of the conversations we're going to have about climate change, biodiversity loss, and solutions and actions. And yeah, I don't have a window, sadly, so I can't see much. I'm sitting at the University of Alberta, so that's where I've been working for a couple of years, and I'm in my little cubicle.
Well, definitely, climate change is a problem that we need to solve as soon as possible. Forest fires, they are a big deal and they cause a great loss of life. Like I was mentioning backstage, back here in Bangalore, India, it's around 9 p.m. It's 22 degrees Celsius, and the rains have not let up for weeks. The skies, like outside my window, I can see that the skies are so dark, obviously, because it's night, but sometimes even at 10 a.m., it looks as if it's 7 p.m. And I can see the city traffic outside, which glows in a blur, and the air carries that earthly smell of wet trees because it's been raining so much, and the kind of atmosphere that makes you to pause and notice the world a little differently. And now that we have painted that picture, let's start right at the beginning. Sports aren't usually linked with ecology, but Timm, you've bridged science exploration and sports in unique ways. So, what first sparked your passion for connecting the natural world with human endurance, and what was little Timm's first adventure?
Right. So if I go back a little bit in time, I've always been extremely passionate about sports and biology. Those were my two favorite subjects at school, and that sort of continued until the end of my schooling, and then I had the opportunity. So my plan was always to study sports, and that was out of question for me. I was always going to go to university and do a degree in in kinesiology or sports, something in that context. And then I spent 6 months in New Zealand before starting my, just having a bit of time before starting my university. And I kind of switched. So I went from that sports passion to the biology passion. So and then I studied something called geoecology, which I started in Germany. So studying the different spheres, be it the soil and the atmosphere and water and the biosphere, biodiversity. So it was really always this kind of on the balance, I would say. Is it going to be sports? Is it biology? And it kind of tipped into favor of biology. And I've been going through pretty much that whole progression of academic degrees. So I did a bachelor's, a master's, a PhD. I came to Canada for my postdoc. And then I arrived at a point where I really felt I've been doing all this research, but what's the true impact of why I'm doing this? And at some point, about 4 years ago, I looked at a map from BirdLife International. So it's a global partnership for the protection of migratory birds and their habitats. And they have this map of flyways. And flyways are those corridors from north to south or vice versa that really depict in a simplified way the migrations of birds. And something just absolutely resonated and clicked. And I was thinking this would be so cool to traverse these flyways, so become a bird, so to speak, and really get more into storytelling. And that's for me the birthplace of my ambitions now, to try and blend sports and my athletic passion and my experience, my knowledge in ecology and conservation. So trying to find this space where I can maximize my personal impact to do good for the planet. So I'd say that's my starting point. And it's, as we sometimes do have maybe just a moment of like a spark moment that really, changes our approach and the way we do things. The second part, first adventure, I'd say the biggest adventure that I can really think of, that I can really memorize well, is going overseas for the first time. So I'm German born, and we'd usually with family, we'd go somewhere in Europe, but the first trip was to Singapore. So the first time literally getting on a plane and flying long distance, and it was a stopover in Singapore on my way to Australia. So it was a school exchange for 2 months in Australia. And I remember that's going to reveal my age, but it was in the late 90s, and there wasn't really much in terms of internet searching and planning. So I'd basically go to travel agencies and get those travel kind of magazines where you could get an in-depth understanding of the places you go to. And I'd be sitting at home with my scissors and cut out little pictures and stories about Australia and create my own little folder. And then I proposed this absolutely outrageous, unrealistic trip to my host family, which was basically, I don't know, it was a 2-month stay. So something like 50 days of traveling around Australia. But I still have this very deep connection to that trip. It's difficult to describe, but I definitely say that was my first big adventure and really opened up the world to me. This idea of exploration and sort of finding your way, your path. It still resonates strongly. And I did my PhD in Australia, so it was really nice to return with a bit more time and really immerse myself into those places that it was impossible to fit what I wanted to do into those 2 months. So I had much more time afterwards to make up for it.
Wow, I love that, because honestly, traveling the world is so wonderful. And listening to your story, it makes the whole idea of passion so much more approachable. Like, for example, when we think of sports, our minds often leans towards personal achievement, like beating your own best time, lifting heavier, or running further. But in your story, you combine your passion for sports and biology and traveling, to bridge to bridge it outwards for ecosystems, to conservation, to communities. And that really speaks to us as students, because in colleges we are often told to chase individual successes, the grades, the internships, the big win. But you're showing that endurance can stretch beyond ourselves. It's more about opening new ways of seeing and reaching people who wouldn't normally connect towards science, by mixing your different passions. And what's striking is how you've carried two powerful alter egos, like the athlete who endures with the body, and then the scientist who endures with the mind throughout your journey. So, when you face big challenges, do those alter egos ever speak to each other? And how does that dialogue help you reach and inspire people who might not usually connect with one side alone?
Ooh, that's such a such an interesting question. I would say for me, the science is very much the foundation of everything, in a lot of ways, of everything we do. It has a science foundation, and then there's of course indigenous knowledge as well, which is increasingly recognized, which is so important. So there's the science foundation, and for me, the athletic component is really the vehicle to transport the scientific knowledge to people. And it's, as you said, I think the challenge is, how do we reach people who don't easily gravitate towards conservation? And a lot of people enjoy nature, and everyone depends on nature, but people don't necessarily understand a lot of the connections of individual actions, and how this impacts nature. And so this deeper understanding is oftentimes lacking. So I'm really trying to focus increasingly on storytelling. So not just using facts and numbers, and those are absolutely essential, but it's oftentimes so abstract. It's very difficult for the human mind to understand, what does it mean if, let's say, 70% of wildlife populations have been lost in the last 50 years. It's an example number, but it's such a depressing number, but it doesn't necessarily resonate with the human. So I feel it's important to embed the knowledge we have into storytelling, finding ways finding ways that speak to people, where people start thinking differently, and get into a place of transformation that we need. So yeah, I think, yeah, as sort of with your question, I think it's a sort of joint adventure, perhaps between the scientific background and the athletic ambition of driving change, I would say.
Absolutely, and that's really powerful, because what I'm hearing is that when you let those sides speak to each other, you're also going beyond just solving those challenges for yourself or with plain numbers. You're opening doors for different kinds of people to step into the story using the power of storytelling. And that's what makes you a better communicator and more relatable. Eventually, we need people to join in to relate with the facts and figures using languages. That's the power of languages. And that reminds me a bit of Ben 10, a cartoon that I used to watch. He never really relies on one alien form. Sometimes raw strength is needed, sometimes you need brains and adaptability. And the real power comes from knowing when to switch. And as students, it's the same. We often feel pressure to pick a single identity: the math god, the fast and furious, the doodler. And not all of them are our strongest. But when we let our different sides collaborate with each other, we can reach audiences who might not have connected with just one version of ourselves. And maybe our in betweenness isn't like a weakness at all, but it's like a bridge. It's a kind of thing which lets us to translate between worlds, just like Ben 10 switches aliens to tackle different challenges. And I think that idea of letting multiple perspectives inform your approach also applies to understanding complex systems in the real world. So, Tim, in your research in Thailand, for example, you have been studying forests that aren't whole, fragmented ecosystems, edge effects, and regenerations. I'd love to hear what's one field observation that completely shifted your understanding of how these fragmented ecosystems actually function, and beyond the data and the numbers, what did you see, hear, or feel in the field that revealed how fragmentation reshapes an ecosystem?
Right, yeah. So as you said, I've spent a lot of time in Southeast Asia studying topics like deforestation and fragmentation and species invasions. And to take a step back, when I was a bachelor student back home in Germany, I had a class in biogeography, and it was it was easily my favorite class. And very early into the semester, our professor introduced a book called The Song of the Dodo. Don't know if you know, it's written by David Quammen. So that's the early 2000s when the book came out. And it's just been it was the most fascinating book to me. So I've read it so many times, and it was really a time travel to Darwin and Wallace and their explorations. And a lot of the chapters cover forest fragmentation, including this project in Brazil, which was initiated in, I forget if it was the 70s or 80s, but Thomas Lovejoy and Bill Lawrence and some really famous conservation scientists who initiated this project in Brazil, looking at deforestation and fragmentation. And for me, I got this beautiful opportunity, I don't know, 30, 40 years later, trying to do the math here, but yeah, a couple of decades later, to actually be part of this project on forest fragmentation in Borneo. So it was really inspired by this initial project in Brazil and taking on board a lot of the lessons learned and a lot of the science conducted from this initial project. And then what we did in Borneo was looking at basically the progress from a rainforest turned into an oil palm plantation. And we didn't cut I have to say, we didn't cut the forest for science, but we just took advantage of a company planting oil palm plantations, basically. So we were allowed to monitor this whole progress, which had never been done before. So just a bit of background, but to answer your question, I would say it really helped me to understand invasion dynamics. I found that very, very powerful as an example, because you enter this primary rainforest and it's so beautiful. In Borneo, it's this dipterocarp forest, crazy tall trees, and actually a quite open understory, very different from what people oftentimes associated with a rainforest ecosystem. So it's not dense. It's kind of this dense jungle phrase, even if I don't like to use jungle, but it's sort of that what people have in mind. But it's a very open forest ecosystem that you can easily walk through. You don't necessarily need a machete, but then you go into a disturbed forest ecosystem, lacking those big trees because they've been selectively logged. And suddenly it's a whole different experience. You have so many more invasive species, so that's both native but also introduced. And yeah, we always had to run around with a machete. And when I was doing my research, I had local helpers who were just absolutely ingenious in what they were doing. And so maybe we talk about this a little bit later. But I found those invasion dynamics very, very apparent, being in fragmented landscapes. The project I did in Thailand, this was in about 300 kilometers northeast of Thailand, a tropical dry forest system, which you'd have quite a bit in India too, and actually super threatened, like very little remains because it's so much more accessible, it's good wood. So it was literally this island in this matrix of agriculture. So it was very striking to see the differences, even running studies across the edge. So you have this forest fragment, and then you go into the surrounding landscape and just monitoring how temperature changes and humidity changes, and obviously the species too. So there was, very powerful to study this too. And to give some maybe kind of exciting examples, so when I lived in Borneo, I was living in a hammock for a couple of years, washing in rivers, and as basic as it gets. And sometimes we'd see clouded leopards, and they're just such beautiful wild cats, and they're usually pretty much exclusively arboreal. So they'd be in those big trees and going from one tree to another. But because the landscape I was working in was lacking big trees, you'd find them on logging roads, and I always found that, yeah, quite a good kind of example of what logging and fragmentation does. And even orangutans. I have some interesting images of orangutans on the ground, a big male orangutan walking in a weed-infested environment very close to an oil palm plantation. So you do witness in the species what fragmentation does to the health of an ecosystem.
Absolutely, Tim. And listening to what you described about your fieldwork in Thailand, that actually makes me see fragmentation in a whole new way. When we think about forest fragmentation, and this ties up to the conversation that we were having earlier, it's easy to reduce it to just lines on a map or percentages of habitat loss. But seeing it in the field, experiencing it, noticing the exotic plant invasions, feeling how the edges they are hotter, windier, and drier. It shows how much it changes which plants and animals can survive, and how predator prey interactions and the forest balance, everything gets affected. And I think ecological data that comes alive in those experienced moments, hearing all the birds calls fails, feeling the sun and the wind differently, seeing the understory shift. It's a really powerful example of how human actions, whether you have deforestation, whether you have infrastructure or agriculture, it entirely reshapes forest dynamics entirely. And speaking of human actions, logging is often framed as an economic versus conservation trade-off. So from your research, Tim, what nuance do you wish both policymakers and the public understood about logging's real ecological footprint?
Yeah, really good question. I'd say the first one is that logging is just so pervasive. It's not necessarily as obvious as deforestation, but the amount of land that has been impacted by logging is way greater than what has been impacted by deforestation. And logging is always, I'd say, if we look at the human body as a kind of analogy, it's sort of a weakening of a functioning system. So you're pulling out pieces, and unfortunately it's usually the big trees, like those very mature, tall, big trees, which have a high economic value, but they're also really the fabric for life in those forest ecosystems. And they're basically, you might have seen some examples of where people, and I think you had Megan Lowman at some point in your podcast too, and I think she really focuses on canopies and this idea of
Yes.
tall trees, and they're basically an ecosystem in themselves, right? And people increasingly understand just the wealth of species that are supported by those big trees. And so I think that's really something that needs to be understood. So pulling out those big trees has such a huge impact, both from a carbon point of view. So if we want to look at climate change and the impacts of that forest, the benefits that forests have for storing carbon, it's usually the big trees which absorb so much more. That's where most of the carbon is being stored. But at the same time, for biodiversity, and that's so many species that we don't even know because so few people go up into those canopies. So there's so much knowledge that hasn't been, so much that hasn't been explored yet, and that isn't understood. So I feel, appreciating the impacts that even the harvesting of a single tree can have is really important. And that's not even to kind of talk about all the sort of when vehicles come into a forest, and it's got impacts on the soil. It's sort of the movement of heavy vehicles is compacting the soil, so water infiltration, changes. So big impacts on different processes and forests.
That's such an important point, Tim. Logging is not only what we see, it's much more than deforestation. It's more about the entire rewiring of the ecosystem, like the understory plants, the soil processes, you have the microclimates, and then you have animal communities. All of them change, making the forest more vulnerable to invasive species and then slowing its natural recovery. And I think hearing this, it makes me realize that even managed logging on paper, that still can have a cascading and long lasting effects, which is definitely something that we all need to think about and reflect upon this wildlife day. And speaking of on paper stuff, you have trained in international environmental law through the United Nations system. So, how did that legal lens change the way you looked at conservation science? Like, did it give you more optimism about governance or more realism about its limits?
Right. Yeah. So there was actually that was interesting. It was a time, I forget, I think it was after my master's degree, and I was a little bit, maybe a little bit lost. I wasn't sure what are my next steps going to be. And I saw this program offered by the UN, by UNITA, for in environmental law. And I thought that sounded really interesting and fascinating. And I'd never really looked into law as a student previously. And I'd say what it really helped, I've never, I have to admit, I've never really used it much, but I felt it was such a wonderful way to understand context and scale. So I think the challenge oftentimes can be with research that, and we share that same passion. It's about making a difference, and we're very idealistic. And when I started my PhD and did all this research in Borneo, I felt I'm doing this research now, and it's going to change the world, kind of along those lines. But in reality, of course, afterwards you find out it's not that simple, and for different reasons, but it's not that simple. So I think understanding that policy and law, those governing um, sort of agreements, be it globally or be it nationally, are kind of one end of the spectrum. I feel it's the policies, the laws, and then it's the people, maybe the people you engage with and the decisions people make is sort of on the other side of the spectrum. So it's just really helped me to navigate scale and understanding of where does conservation and my research fit into the larger puzzle piece, as compared to just doing research and then expecting someone's going to do something with the research and surely it's going to make a difference. I'd say that's the biggest takeaway learning that I had from doing this course. So I found it really interesting. As I said, I've never really directly utilized it. I've never worked in the policy space, but it's helped me to give a different perspective, I would say.
That's surely a new perspective, and it's all about looking at the whole picture, the big picture. Science, it tells us about the why, and I think law, that speaks about the how. And both of them, they need to come together even if they speak very different languages. As STEM students, we are generally trained to focus on hypothesis, data, and experiments, while the legal world, it's built on precedents, statuses, policies, and advocacies. And I think, yes, absolutely, solving big conservation problems, it often means stepping out of your own field and standing up for what's right and learning how to present that scientific evidence in a way that holds up in, maybe holds up in a courtroom or informs enforceable decisions. And it's, I think, all in all, it's about turning knowledge into action. However, bridging science and law isn't easy. They speak very, very different languages. So, Tim, how can STEM students begin to think in the structured, precedent driven way that law requires?
I think one option might be to actually take courses, excuse me, take courses during the undergraduate studies. So I'd always kind of advocate for not going a very narrow channeled route, but definitely exploring different subjects a little bit, if possible, if offered by universities. I found for myself when I was doing my master's degree in New Zealand, it was really interesting for me to join local NGOs because they have bylaws, and it's in the beginning I didn't really understand what people were discussing and talking about, and I didn't understand why everything has to be so finicky and particular in the writing and so precise, and we'd in a way be a casual group of conservationists, but we had to follow those kind of strict procedures as we went through those different meetings we had. And the same at the university. We have a climate, I think it's called Climate Action Coalition here at the university. And it's similar. There's bylaws, there's kind of rules and regulations. And I think that's a helpful way to understand, to both get active, so to really be part of a community, a group, and take action in. There's so many different ways that conservation work can be done, right, or with the motivation of conservation. But it also gives this very, very interesting insight into how law affects everyday life in a way, and how conservation is structured from a policy point of view. So that's something I'd recommend, getting active in a small group. And the other one would be just taking some courses if possible.
That's such an important point, and definitely seeing things from the legal lens, from the policy point of view, is crucial. And I think this also ties a bit into the point on storytelling, which you mentioned earlier. I think this might help. As students, it's generally very easy to get caught up in the technical details, but to engage a wider audience, we need to go beyond just informing and focus more on inspiring. And it's about finding that emotional core, the adventure, the human connection, or the wonder of nature, and turning it into a story that makes people care, helping them feel a shared responsibility for the natural world. Because when numbers they meet words, data becomes a story, and understanding becomes connection. So definitely looking at things from the legal perspective can help. And on that note of human connection, Tim, you've done fieldwork across cultures and continents. Ethical, respectful engagement with local communities is crucial yet tricky for young researchers. So, what guiding principles do you use to ensure that research and outreach are culturally respectful and mutually beneficial?
Yeah, really good question. Very important. And it's nice to see that a lot of universities do embrace this important component increasingly. So that's important for me. I've always, so when I worked in Borneo, so I'd go there as a scientist, and then I have my local research. They were called local research assistants, but in all honesty, they knew everything and I didn't know anything. So I'm working in this place, Borneo, the most plant biodiverse place on the planet. So those two guys, Roy and Mamad, they were basically the ones being able. So my research was focused on plants, so they were able to distinguish between different species, which was completely impossible to me. So I'd like to call them my research collaborators. And for me, I've always gone places reminding myself I'm a guest. I'm very privileged to learn from locals. I don't know anything about the place, so I'm here to learn. Yes, I'm doing research, and I'm trying to finish my degrees, and that's part of my studies. But I'm the guest, so it's really removing this colonial lens, which has been part of science for such a long time, and sadly oftentimes still continues to this day. So really being very, very open, removing any any prejudices or any. I've always tried to really create a bridge between my collaborators locally and myself. So trying, because that's challenging. So when I started in Borneo, it was basically the scientists living in one part of the camp, the local collaborators living in one camp. But it wasn't easy to really connect on a deeper level. It was always this, you're the ones from Western, so-called Western country, we're the locals, you're kind of high up here, we're lower. So I've tried to, yeah, really give my collaborators a feeling of we're all equal. And I find it was quite successful. So in the end, it was really, they were playing tricks on me. We've had a lot of fun in the field. I don't know, we had incidences where, so usually what we do is we live in this little camp and it's just a makeshift camp. There's no internet, there's no Wi-Fi. It's basically as basic and wild as it gets. And then every day we'd have to drive. So there were, like, we had some jeeps, so we had to drive to different future forest fragments to collect our data. Sometimes we had to walk for several hours to get places, and sometimes we had to camp remotely away from the main camp. And Roy and Mamad, in the beginning, they were very, very much what I suggested we do, they're going to do. But they did become quite rebellious towards the end. So sometimes we'd go in a nice way. We'd go to one of those remote camps and I'd be leaving on my own and I'd say, see you guys at the data collection place at one of our plots. And they'd never come. So I'd basically be, which I shouldn't tell the university for safety issues, but I'd basically be somewhere in the rainforest on my own. I come back, I'm a little bit grumpy, but they'd be happily fishing, they so, but in a way, I always looked at this as a very much a compliment in a way, because for them to have the courage to do this, to really kind of let me go and not feeling this obligation to come and join me and look after me. And I felt, I kind of looked at this as a compliment, because to me it felt we're very comfortable around each other. They're doing something to me which they would do to their friends in a way. And I feel, so in those situations I felt we're really on par, we're at eye level, we're communicating in a very genuine, friendship way. So that's what I've always tried to do, remove this colonial lens as much as possible, immediately be a guest and try to build bridges along the route, embrace them as much as possible in the storytelling. So all the media I've always had after publishing papers, I'd make sure I write some blog post and get lots of photos of Roy and Mamad and really emphasize how crucial they were for me to finish my PhD, because at the end we had something like 1,200 plant species identified as part of my project. And that includes people in the herbarium in Borneo, in Sabah, where I was doing the research. I could have never done this. So I think that's one really important component.
Absolutely, and that's such a valuable insight for our young researchers today, that the core really lies in humility and genuine respect. Rather than arriving with pre-made solutions, it's about co-creating with communities, friendships, and making sure that research or outreach truly benefits them. You are the guest, giving them a sense of ownership and partnership. And it's mostly about building trust, understanding local priorities, and ensuring that science works hand in hand with social responsibility. And speaking of research, you have studied everything from trophic systems to human modified landscapes, balancing depth and breadth. So, for students aiming to become interdisciplinary conservation scientists, should they focus first on depth or breadth? And how can they ensure that their research stays connected to real world conservation challenges?
Yeah, I would say I would choose breadth over depth. So when we talk about early stages of a university education, I think really because so when I did my degree back home in Germany, it was very much coming from a classroom setting at high school to a classroom setting at university, where we all in a way did the same classes, which were kind of given to us as the classes we had to pick. But I always try to, and in Germany it's a free education, so I have to add, it's very easy to just add a couple of classes if you choose to, because we don't have to pay. It's different here in North America. But so I still went to do some what did I do? So I did some courses I had a couple of classes in sports, so I couldn't completely step away. So I attended some of those, and then I had classes in more in the social sciences as well. So I feel taking opportunity of understanding, well, it's basically the appreciation that conservation is a question of human actions and human decision making. So it's not separate, right? It's part of, it has such a strong human component. So I'd always encourage, yes, take a law course and take a course in maybe even business. I see so many people who come to conservation with a very different degree than the one I have. So and these days, when we talk about storytelling, even I think there's social media degrees now, for example. So there's so many ways where we can arrive at a point where we want to be through very different avenues, which is, let's say we want to be a conservation advocate. There's different ways to get to that point. And so I feel taking a broader approach is more valuable, because it really gives us an insight on how things are connected, how things are related. That would be my suggestion.
Absolutely. Starting with breadth, looking at different things from different lenses, and then understanding your interests. And then later on, going on with depth, mastering a discipline. That is essential too, but it must be paired with collaboration and learning across the fields, making it as interdisciplinary as possible. And with initiatives like Flyway Heroes, which combines citizen science and exploration, I think that's a great example of becoming a T-shaped scientist. And on that note of interdisciplinary, we've also written over 40 articles for Westdeutsche Zeitung to bring conservation issues to public consciousness. I hope I pronounced that right. So, going back in time, what did you learn about what truly resonates with a general audience when writing about conservation? And more importantly, how did that differ from how scientists talk to each other?
Yeah, that's the way you pronounce this was amazing, honestly. German is a difficult language, so well done. Yeah, this was a really fantastic opportunity back then, where on a monthly basis I could write about my experiences overseas. So I'd be writing about New Zealand and Thailand and Australia and Borneo, and I don't know if it lasted until India, because I did spend quite a bit of time in India at some point. So I was working with, I'm digressing a little bit, but I was working with a wildlife filmmaker in Mumbai, Sumesh Lekhi, and we'd go to places like Bandipur and film tigers, and that was just absolutely fascinating. But yeah, coming back to the communication element, maybe at the time I didn't realize so much necessarily the importance of storytelling. To me, it was more an opportunity to share my experiences. But if I look back now, it's this realization that if we want to communicate science, storytelling is arguably the single most powerful way. And this can be in writing or could be in film, different ways of communicating. So I think people like human adventures. People like human quest. And I think that's a very powerful entrance gate for hooking people into messaging. And today, from the lens of today, I would say it's been an opportunity to plant seeds. So whenever I wrote about my experiences, it always had a conservation angle to it, because this is what I was doing. So at the time, maybe not consciously, but looking back from what I know now, it would have been this opportunity to plant the seeds for people to learn and really look at things through a different lens. It's not your typical travel report. I've gone to this place and I've done this and that's the food I'm eating, but it's a more conservation angled storytelling approach. So that's what I'd say. It's mostly the recognition of today having come this journey, as compared to at the time. So it's this awareness of the importance of storytelling to really get people to care and to act.
Absolutely. And I think it's so interesting how different communicating to the public is, as compared to how STEM students or even scientists, how they talk to each other. Like, in my experience in scientific papers, the focus is more on precision, it's on methods, it's on uncertainty, and most importantly citing each and every source. Like, it's super dense and technical. But on the other hand, when you talk about public communication, it's more about clarity, it's more about connecting, it's more about forming those personal human connections. You need a story, one clear takeaway, and a way for people to relate to the work so that they can really absorb what you're trying to say. And it's less about proving each and every detail and more about helping people understand why it matters and what they can do. However, when we talk about journalism, it requires timeliness. And while ecology often requires patience and long timelines, um, how did you bridge that gap in your reporting? And what advice do you have for students who are trying to turn slow science into compelling, newsworthy stories?
Yeah, good point. Science publishing is a very slow process, and it's a big grind. That's for sure. And as you said, it's kind of the just kind of navigating that space a little bit, that disconnect between how the pace of science versus the pace of journalistic efforts. And that's, to be fair, when I look at your generation, I think you guys are so much more versed in social media and outreach, and there's so many opportunities these days to tell stories before the science has actually happened, before you have the kind of the numbers. So say you're doing a research project, it's an opportunity to invite people to be part of this journey, right? So you could say you do field work and you're in an exciting place in Tamil Nadu or somewhere, and you do cool research on elephants. And it's basically an opportunity to bring people on this journey, which I think helps so much too, because it's not just this is what I found and this is the outcome, but people have been part of, have been followed along, and they understand much more the context. And science is so, as you said, it's so dense and it's so easily overwhelming. So if you have a bit of time to bring people on a journey, you don't have to overwhelm people, which I think is a challenge too, because science is not, it's not easy to break it down into just one single message. But if the messaging happens over time, it's much easier to digest and it's much easier for people to understand, because it's so much about context, right? It's, again, when this example I gave in the beginning of 70% of wildlife populations lost, in a way it's just a number, but you can't give people all the context, all the reasons, all the causes, all the solutions in one go. So I think if you can slowly kind of filtrate knowledge and understanding to people, to me that seems really powerful. And yeah, when I was doing my degrees, I didn't really have the means to do this, but I think these days that's something I definitely encourage young students to do. Invite people around you to tell that story, because it is so important, and it's not just an end goal, but it is a journey.
Absolutely. Numbers, they honestly can't make people feel. And I think what you mentioned, that's a brilliant approach, Tim. And it really captures the challenge that we face in today's fast paced world. When we talk about slow science, it's careful, it's based on long term observations of trends and processes. And it's honestly truly fundamental for understanding how different things work. But journalism and public interest, they often demand hooks, immediate hooks, urgent narratives, and then stories that are easy to digest. And bridging that gap, that seems to require a high skill in creativity and communication, embedding those long-term ecological insights within exciting and timely events or expeditions, or using visuals, local examples, or human storytelling to make that science tangible. And I think for our listeners out there, for students, it's a lesson in patience, it's a lesson in storytelling and translation, taking those complex gradual processes and highlighting why they matter now in ways that engage and inspire people without compromising the scientific integrity. That's very crucial. And I think on that note of grabbing attention and today's era of social media, visuals play a huge role in grabbing eyeballs. So, as a photographer, how does looking through a camera lens change the way you observe ecosystems compared to looking through a scientific lens? And how do you capture those 10 million reasons?
Right. Yeah. So to give some context, with 10 million reasons is the Instagram account that I first created, and it was kind of around this ambition of documenting as many species as possible. And I'd say photography has always been a kind of passion byproduct of the wonderful, exciting places I visited. And when I was living in Borneo, I just see species that hardly anyone ever gets to see, because I spend so much time in a remote location. And I probably use mostly a natural history lens, I would say. I'm not necessarily just scientific, and same for photography, but it's more a natural history lens, where maybe blending the two. So that's how I would describe the way I. So when I cycle, and we talk about this a little bit later, I think, but when I do my cycling expeditions and it's framed around a conservation context, so when I look at landscapes, something that maybe someone who's not trained in ecology or so wouldn't be able to just notice the nuanced differences between a really nice native grassland versus more a tame pasture where plants have been planted, or wouldn't necessarily see, oh, this land here has been recently converted from grassland into agriculture. So it's really a natural history lens that I'm using, and just got the passion to capture species. And I felt it's a nice framing of, like, a motivation to get as many species as possible. So 10 million is sort of an estimate. Obviously, we know there's so many species out there which haven't been identified, and it's kind of a rough estimate of how much is out there.
Absolutely. Natural history. That's such an insightful perspective, Tim. And this again ties into what we were talking about earlier. Facts alone aren't enough to spur action. People need to care first. And as cliche as it may sound, a picture really does speak a thousand words, which is why Instagram works so well. And that's where your camera lens comes in, which lets you to capture not just the landscape as a whole, but the life within it, like the sharp eyes of a bird in flight, or the precise movement of its wings, or the subtle ways that the animals they interact with their environment. I think it allows a broader audience, including those who don't normally engage with environmental stories, to have a bit of a better connection with nature. And on that note, definitely to our listeners, check out at the rate of 10 million reasons on Instagram for some truly breathtaking shots. And speaking of birds, Tim, can you tell us the tale behind Wings of Survival, and why did you choose migratory birds as the heart of your storytelling?
Yeah, so Wings of Survival it's an initiative, and it's as I mentioned earlier, it's this idea of blending sports and conservation into one very organic story. And as I mentioned, it was largely inspired by the flyways. And birds are just they give us such a wonderful perspective into the natural world, into connections. So yeah, there's various reasons why birds are just the ideal partner on those expeditions. They're beautiful, they're everywhere. So that was really important too. So it doesn't matter which continent we go to. That's the group of animals that we found in every continent that we find in every continent. And it's this idea of connecting places across borders, right? So especially at a time where we find that a lot of nation states are kind of closing their doors and away from this idea of a world that acts together. But we know that the global challenges are, well, as the name suggests, they're global. We need local effort, but it's a global quest to solve the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and pollution. It's all interconnected. So birds, they're this nice indicator species which connects places based on their migrations, and there's no borders to them. And something that a lot of people don't know is about 40 to 50% of birds are migratory. So usually we see cranes, and out here in Northern America we see lots of geese, Canada geese, and they come to the campus and they're up on the building and they're kind of calling, and so we know the season is changing. But most people don't know that there's around 11,000 species of birds on the planet. About 40 to 50% migrate, so that's a huge chunk, and it's oftentimes those little warblers, and they go from the boreal forest here all the way to the tropics, and we don't know because they travel at night. And yeah, so we have this incredible evolutionary miracle of migrations, which is really bringing us together and reminding us as humanity to act in concert, in tandem, right? If we want to solve those problems, we also have to work together. So I think birds are just a wonderful indicator species, and people can see them, people can hear them. There's really cool apps now, like Merlin app from Cornell University, where you can go outside and you turn on Merlin, and then it's recording the soundscape around you, and then you can actually get photos of the birds that are singing in your surroundings. And it works really well in North America, where most of the kind of data is infiltrated into those, kind of informs the algorithms. But I know India, for example, I've met so many passionate conservation minded people in India, and lots of bird enthusiasts. So I wouldn't be surprised if Merlin works really well in India too. So Wings of Survival is basically this attempt to use storytelling around athletics and nature to win more people for stewardship, for looking after the planet. Because as I said earlier, we know that human stories really resonate with humans, and that's just natural. The way we interact, we have the closest connection to our kind, and that's the same for any species. Every species connects most deeply to their own fellow individuals, right? So, having been in academia for so long, I feel it takes a human element to get more people vested into nature. So in a way, what we're doing is we are athletes as humans, but then we're presenting birds as the greatest athletes on the planet because they do things which are absolutely crazy. They fly from Alaska all the way to Australia, New Zealand, crossing the entire Pacific. Whereas for us humans, we're mostly content about, let's say, finishing a marathon once in our lifetimes. And it's just nothing compared to what birds achieve. So it's this building bridges between the natural world and the kind of human world to give people a much deeper sense of how do we fit into the biosphere, how do we fit into this fabric of life. And I think that's super important, and that's what we're trying to achieve with Wings of Survival. And the first expedition is next year from Alaska to Patagonia, so that's crossing the entire Americas, 15 countries, around 9 months. And what we're doing in Alaska is we put little GPS transmitters on whimbrels. So whimbrels they're a shorebird. They've got a long beak, maybe the size of a chicken, and they travel potentially all the way to the end of the southern tip of South America. And scientists have been monitoring those birds and their migrations. So we're taking advantage of an ongoing research project. And so we meet those birds in Alaska, put the little GPS transmitters, and then we start our journey, and the birds are breeding and they have their offspring, and then they follow a bit later, but they'll overtake us because they're much quicker. And then maybe we see them again in stopover locations in Mexico or Colombia or somewhere in Central America. And the story arc is, do we reunite in South America, in Patagonia? So that's kind of hopefully to interest people in this parallel journey between birds and us. And when we collect science, kind of scientific data, on us humans, which we relate back to the bird, avian, physiological data. So using science, using community engagement, so working with different organizations on the routes. It's a big undertaking.
And I think that's a very beautiful vision, Tim. And I think students, they can learn a lot from this storytelling approach. Birds are magnificent species, and like you mentioned, we have the closest connection to our own kind. So the idea to pick a living thread which connects us across this fabric of life, something which links people and places, like migratory bird, a river, or even a seasonal event, and use it to shape both research and outreach. For example, the Flyaway project that could show how something is happening in a campus wetland and how that connects to global declines in a species. It's a way to make conservation feel real and more connected to the world. And speaking of pushing boundaries and connecting science to human experiences, Tim, your expeditions like cycling 30,000 kilometers, that must push you to extremes physically and mentally. So, how do you mentally prepare for ultra endurance challenges? And can you share a moment on your expedition that tested you the most? Like, what has the endurance lab of your own body taught you about risk, resilience, and communicating these lessons in a way that pure data never could?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question, and I like that you're bringing up resilience. It's really I see it as a story of hope and resilience, and the birds are they're really leading the way. They're so resilient in what they do. Just this idea of migration itself, which seems so daunting, and what's the motivation to go places for any migratory animal. So it's a question of resources, of course, of survival ultimately. So a question of, where do I find my food? Where do I have my offspring? So for me mentally, the biggest one is that I feel this is the most I can do. This is the project where I'm really bringing all my talents and skills and experiences into the mix. So it's this idea of maximizing individual impact for the planet. And that's obviously different for everyone. But for me, this is this idea of sports and ecology, or sports and nature. So from a mental point of view, I always like to remind myself that I'm just a catalyst. It's not about me. I'm just the person doing the ride, but it's for a much bigger cause. So it's maybe again this idea of scale, which I think is very, very important. It's coming out of this idea of the world revolves around myself, to this is a beautiful, unreal planet that we live on. So that helps me mentally, because it's not just a journey, but it's that whole process of preparation, which means talking to sponsors for fundraising, planning the route, logistics. It's like I've been working on this now for 4 years, and it's an incredible grind, and it's very much a roller coaster ride, because you have these beautiful ups where something wonderful happens. So to give an example, a couple of years ago, the expedition I'm doing with my partner, Liana, so it's the two of us on bicycles. And about 3 years ago, we met a filmmaker here in Edmonton, and he was absolutely hooked on the project. So he's been following us for the last 3 years to different places around this flyway in the Americas. So this really leveraged our ability to create very compelling materials, professional trailers. And so this is one of the highlights. But then you also have low points, because you might feel, oh, this organization is such a good fit, and surely they're going to come on board and support, but they don't. And it seemed so intuitive. So it's a roller coaster ride, but it's, for us, I feel it's been at least the right trajectory. So it's a nicely progressing upwards trajectory. So that's really giving me a lot of mental strength to do what I'm doing. Just that feeling of I'm doing the right thing. This is what I'm destined to do, and really seeing that a lot of people love the project, are interested, want to be part of it, want to support it. That's really important. And the physical component of resilience, endurance, I just train a lot. I train 2, 3, 4 hours every day. So usually my Garmin tells me your training readiness is 5 out of 100. So it's pretty low usually, because I'm training a lot. So, but we also do Ironman events, so swimming, cycling, running, a lot of competitions. So it's kind of natural to me to exercise a lot. Yeah.
Absolutely. Experiencing scale and the entire grind, the process, it shows that resilience is something that you live, something that you practice, and something that you learn from. And I think it's a great reminder for all our listeners that we often chase our next deadline or the next experiment, pushing past exhaustion as if endurance alone is the goal. But I think on a deeper level, true resilience grows more in pauses, in reflection, and in the moments that we allow ourselves to recover, to reflect, and to be the best versions of ourselves. And on that note of resilience, Tim, your journeys often mirrored the greatest migrations of birds, cycling and pack rafting across the same flyways they've followed over for millennia. Students usually see birds only when they arrive or leave, but you have traced the spaces in between, the long invisible miles, as they call it. So when you travel those routes, do you ever try to see the world through the eyes of the birds themselves, to feel the landscapes, the barriers, the rest stops, the threats, and the wonders as they would? And what has that bird's eye journey taught you about resilience, vulnerability, and connection that you could have never learned in any other way?
Yeah, interesting. I have to admit, we haven't done any of the kind of bird human expeditions yet. So next year is the first big one. But what you're mentioning here is absolutely the way it's been designed. So it's designed around, as I mentioned earlier, what are the bridges between birds and humans? How do we create relatability? So people, when I'm saying I'm cycling from Alaska to Patagonia, humans have some kind of response like, this is amazing, or this is crazy, or it triggers something, which is not the case if I'm saying this bird flies from Alaska to Patagonia, because it's a bit too far from what resonates with humans and relatability. So birds, when they do those migrations, as I said, they need incredible resilience, but they're also so vulnerable because the journey in itself is dangerous. But then we as humans, we're adding these many layers of danger to their journey. So we're clearing land, which means they're losing their homes, their stopovers as part of their migration. So maybe where they need to refuel, so they need to land somewhere, get some food in their system, and then continue their journey. But if we are clearing a mangrove forest, for example, they might not have those spaces. And there's all these different threats that we impose on the birds. So they're resilient, but they're also utterly vulnerable. And connection is, as I said, this connection between countries and communities and individuals. And it's, I think, very empowering for, let's say, an organization, a local small organization in Guatemala who does conservation work, to understand the work they're doing is not just on the ground where they're based, but it's connected to the work that organizations are doing across the flyways. So I think it's empowering to understand the efforts that can sometimes be very difficult, because there's a lack of funding, maybe there's a lack of support from communities. It usually comes down to a group of very dedicated, very passionate individuals trying to save a species or an ecosystem. But understanding you're not alone in this quest to protect a bird or any species for that matter, I think is quite empowering. So I like how we can be catalysts by visiting those places. And similar to what I said about the research, it's not so much about I know everything. I've learned in a university context for 10 years. Let's do it my way. But it's arriving on a bicycle, so quite vulnerable too, right? Because we're exposed to traffic and to climate and to fires. So we follow the progression of summer because we start in June, and then it's literally all the way summer to South America. So there's a lot of threats that we face as humans when we embark on this journey. So it's different, but it's similar to the birds. And I think people, when we arrive places, people do see us as being vulnerable, and that creates immediately conversation, but also connection, I feel. So it's this idea of being catalyst for a bigger story, as compared to going places and telling people, look, you have to change these things because we're facing climate change, and now you have to stop driving your car or something. By all means, we're not in a position to tell people what to do. We just want to bring stories, and we want to empower people, make people understand the connections across the flyway, and really champion the work that people do, because oftentimes they don't have a platform, they're not recognized, but they're so essential for protecting the natural support systems that all of us benefit from. So yeah, when it comes to the bird's eye view, I feel we're trying, even we're not flying, we're trying to, as much as possible, build those bridges and being in a position where we can constantly relate back between the birds, their challenges, their athletic capabilities, their physiologies, which are incredibly sophisticated compared to what we are capable of. So we have scientists studying our mind, our body, our nutrition. And that's interesting in itself, but it's also giving us a space where we can talk about how do we change from a physiological standpoint versus the birds. We can create lots of really interesting little stories. And because people are interested in what do we eat, how many calories do we burn, a lot of people are fascinated about those things. We can tie this directly into the bird world. And I think that's this idea of planting seeds. It's not imposing anything on people, but it's giving people an opportunity to learn about the natural world through a different perspective.
Absolutely. Seeing those endless miles, seeing those fragmented habitats, the disappearing rest stops, and also seeing things from the perspective of the birds, like the storms that the birds have to face, all while pushing through your own endurance through rain, through winds, through heat, through smoke. I think what really sets this initiative apart is the concept of empathy. When we talk about relatability, it's not only between humans but also about relating with birds, going through it yourself, which teaches us about resilience, showing vulnerability, and making the connections between human and wildlife feel suddenly real. And it's a perspective that you can't get from a map or a data set or numbers, a way to feel survival, a way to feel interdependence and stewardship, and not just spectated. And talking about looking at things through different lenses and seeing the world in ways that we normally can't. Nocturnal animals live in worlds that we barely see. Has one night encounter ever flipped your understanding of an ecosystem, and what can they teach us that daylight species never can?
Yeah, great question. When I was living in Borneo, I slowly got really hooked into night spotting. So I'd go out at night and try to find animals. And it's, for me, it became almost like an addiction. And I had to be careful that I'm not getting too tired so I can still do my work during the day. But I absolutely loved going out at night. And I take my torch and I take a red light so it doesn't actually harm the animals. But when, especially in the rainforest, the forest comes alive at night. So you have those beautiful insects making almost a deafening sound, but it's a beautiful sound because it's a natural sound, and then you feel you have a much more holistic experience because we're really a being which is so primarily focused on vision. But when you go out at night, you don't see much. So you have your little torch, but you don't see much. So your different senses are really challenged in a greater way. So you rely much more on acoustics, and your sense of smell becomes so much more pronounced. And I always absolutely loved this. It was such a beautiful experience, and some of the most amazing animals I've seen, I saw at night, and you get these very intimate moments. I once saw this banded ginseng, which is a kind of cat-sized arboreal species, a civet with a very long tail, and very few people have probably ever kind of see one. And it was just that magical 5 meter distance, I don't know, 15-minute encounter with this individual animal. And so for me, I try to still do it here in Edmonton as much as I can. I just love the way it, as I said, it challenges your senses in such a deeper way, and it's so much more awareness because we can't rely on vision, which in a way gives us, I think, a little bit of that's kind of our safe space, our comfort zone, if we can see. But once that is limited, we're suddenly a bit more vulnerable, I guess. but at the same time, it allows us to really use those different senses, and yeah, everything's much more vivid and kind of vital, and the way you smell the forest, even vision is interesting. I found during the day it usually everything looks green, but then you go out at night and you shine into the canopy, and there's this diversity of tree species, and you see all these shades of almost from white to very dark green. It's all in there. It's very fascinating. And as I said earlier, most migratory birds, they migrate at night. So there's technologies these days where, at least in the US, they're using radar and they can find those hotspots like Birdcast. They can find those hotspots of when birds are migrating. It's pretty fascinating. And you see, sometimes you ask yourself, where do the birds go at night, and do they where do they sleep? Why do we never see them? And yeah, if you go night spotting and see beautiful kingfishers and all kinds of birds just kind of perched on a little branch and overhanging a river, so they're pretty safe from predators. It's very beautiful.
That's definitely something that I'm going to explore with the few holidays that I have left, night spotting. Because I think, yes, like you mentioned, it pulls us into a hidden dimension of nature. When we see birds in the morning, we see the bright colors, we see the busy forest life. But at the night, I think the entire new world, it comes alive. Like, for example, the very famous example of owls, their silent flight, their incredible night vision, and their super precise hunting. It shows us a side of predator prey dynamics that we rarely get to see in the day animals. And nocturnal animals, they, like you mentioned, they teach us more about the senses beyond our own. An improved sense of smell, and how creatures they share resources across a full day, and how sufficient habitat isn't like only a place, but it's also a time and undisturbed conditions. And these lives, they actually show us how resilient nature can be, but also how fragile it is if we ignore its unseen rhythms. And another insight for National Wildlife Day, to truly protect biodiversity and build landscapes that last, we do need to look at the whole system. So that's a good way to close this question. And speaking of the entire ecosystem, let's shake things up. Let's shake up the branches, stir the soil, and let a little wild energy in. Tim, are you ready to take flight in an incredibly energizing rapid fire round?
Let's do it.
First question coming up. Imagine your life story was a bird migration. So, which three species would carry your highs, your lows, and epiphanies? And could you describe it in German in three poetic words, and please translate it for our audience?
Definitely the whimbrel. So that's our focal species. That would be my high. My low, maybe a crow. And epiphany, I'd pick a warbler. And in German, three poetic words. Three words. Hang on. I have to come up with German now. Not sure. Der schöne Flug. And in English, that would be the beautiful flight.
That's awesome, and I can totally picture that. If I had to say, I think the first would be the phoenix. I know it's a mythological bird, but I think it's a living symbol of resilience and rising from the ashes of every challenge. Uh, the national bird of India, the peacock, which dances boldly through the rain. But how I see it, it really relates to my personality because even though there are dark clouds all around, it's very sad the situation that you're in. But your sunny disposition, your happiness, just like it dances in the rain, I think I do that too. And my life, I would say it's oh 09. Oh no, my entire life is that. And the next question, drawing from the song of the dodo, if you could compose a duet with a bird mimicking or harmonizing with its call, which species would you choose and what story about survival and habitat would you hope to convey?
Oh, what comes to mind is there's a beautiful song about a bird in Hawaii, and it's a bird that is extinct now, and I think it's called Hawaii. I can't pronounce it well, but it's that in a way beautifully portrayed but very sad, tragic story of this bird where only one individual was left, and I think it was, well, it doesn't matter if it's a male or female, if it's the last individual, and it basically had no one to speak to, and it had and it was very much unknown. They only had kind of a call, so that's all that's left, and it's that beautiful call, and you can just imagine how the bird is kind of calling out into the forest and trying to find a mate, but there's just nobody there. So yeah, the ability to have a duet with that bird and Kauai would be pretty amazing. It would mean there's another individual.
I think that's a really vivid image, and it's amazing to think how harmonizing with a bird could bring. It's all about perspectives again, the story of survival and harmony to life. And I think the Indian nightingale or the koel, it would be an incredible addition to that, featuring the nightingale. So, the next question, imagine it's 2036 and 30x 30 by 30 worked. So, what three student led actions from 2026 to 28 would show up in the history books, but almost no one is doing it yet?
Okay, first big one for me, the planet going vegan. To me, whenever I'm asked what's the biggest solution, I feel being plant-based is the single most effective solution tackling the various problems that we face without going into detail. That would be number one. And it's nice to see that a lot of universities are student-driven initiatives where universities, I know at least in the UK, are going completely plant-based. So that would be absolutely my number one. I think the second one, student-led actions. I think the second one would be really students pushing their institutions to making the right choices. So I'm in a province which is very much grounded in oil and gas, and the university is very tied to oil and gas too. So yeah, I feel it has to come from the students. It's not so much governments and people who are running universities. It has to come from students pushing their institutions. So I feel that would be a really good second one, because sorry, I don't know if I'm going too long, but I feel universities should be the institutions which drive societal change, and that's in a lot of ways by design. But at the moment, they're oftentimes failing us. They're not taking on that role of actually embracing their own research as a collective good across universities on the globe. They're basically doing research, but they're not embracing the solutions that research proposes. So that's the second one. Third one, don't know. I feel, as I said earlier, students, they're just so good in social media and all those ways. I feel if everyone who goes places and tells stories starts giving context, not just I'm running somewhere now and this is now such a beautiful lake, but maybe I've witnessed something on the way that relates to climate change or biodiversity loss or pollution. Even pollution, you go hiking and you find pollution along the journey. make this part of your stories, right? It's not just portraying glamorous, beautiful photos, but what's the bigger context? And yeah, I feel students are so clever and good with those things. So maybe that's my number three.
Absolutely. And those three are definitely gems for our change makers out there. Going vegan, embracing research, pushing for positive change, especially in universities, and using social media to show the real side of the world. Well, that was truly inspiring, Tim. To wrap up all the learnings that we have from this episode, let's go ahead with our final segment, the Inspire segment. Tim, who or what has been your biggest inspiration in life and why?
Biggest inspiration, I would say, the planet itself. The chance of having such diversity and beauty is so small. If we look into the odds of having what we have, it's almost unreal. It's greater than having a lottery win, just to have the right conditions for life to flourish the way it does. So I think that's my biggest inspiration, just the beauty of the planet, and reminding myself of the odds of having this. It's so unlikely when you look at the galaxies and the different planets. Everything has to be perfectly right for life on Earth to be what it is. And I think it's just unreal. So that's my biggest inspiration, trying to safeguard as much as possible.
Absolutely. Even when I see, like, when I read encyclopedias and when I see images, especially coming from space, I realize how small we are. There are so many species surrounding us. We have solar systems. We have an Earth. We have a sun. We have so much stuff out there to be discovered, not just in outer space, but on Earth itself, especially underwater. We are truly small creatures, and that's a great inspiration for driving change. And on that note, what words of inspiration were given to you that you would like to pass along to others?
Words of inspiration. I don't have a great quote, but I think it's the encouragement of following one's ethical convictions, like beliefs, because it's usually not mainstream. And well, to give one example, I just mentioned being plant-based. So we're completely plant-based athletes, and the places I go, that's always a lot of people just don't. They maybe haven't spent much time thinking about it, but it's not easy to. It's not convincing people, but really to explaining to people why this is such an important step. So, but in general, I would say, yeah, follow your ethical compass. That's the most important one, because I think it's a very liberating experience. Mhm.
Absolutely. Words are like seeds, and planting them in minds and hearts, and as they grow into curiosity and action, which can ripple far beyond the moment that they are spoken. And to end our episode, Tim, could you give us a call to action? What can children and young people do to make the world a better place?
I'd say look at yourself as a steward of life. So it's that idea of shifting from domination, which is really in most ways what we do with the planet. A shift from domination to stewardship is what we badly need, I feel. So yeah, be a steward to this beautiful planet.
Absolutely. And definitely, change isn't just for the powerful. It's not about domination, it's about stewardship. And it lives in the hands of the hearts of those brave enough to look at themselves, to reflect, and to start today. Tim, I couldn't thank you enough for joining us and sharing your story with our listeners today. From leading epic expeditions, tracing the flyways, or in 2026, migratory birds, to using your camera and storytelling to make science accessible and creating flyway heroes and wings of survival as platforms for global conservation action. I think that your work brings together adventure, science, and advocacy in a way that inspires people like us to connect with nature and find their 10 million reasons. It's been an absolute joy having you today.
Well, thank you so much. And yeah, thank you for all the listeners. And if anyone's interested, by any means, feel free to reach out to me.
Awesome. And yes, to our listeners, I hope that this conversation has sparked inspiration for how you too can take action, whether it's exploring local ecosystems, engaging in citizen science, supporting conservation initiatives, or sharing your own stories. Every action matters. In 2026, Tim will co lead the first Wings of Survival expedition, which is a staggering 30,000-kilometer bike and packraft journey from Alaska to Patagonia, following the epic migration of whimbrels. So, to dive in more into Tim's work, you can visit wingsofsurvival.com. And to keep exploring the intersections of science, adventure, and conservation, subscribe to the SDG Warriors podcast for more conversations with change makers just like Tim, shaping a better world one action at a time. If you like this episode, help spread the word by leaving a review and sharing it with your friends, teachers, classmates, and family. Remember to stay curious and be the change that you wish to see in the world. Happy National Wildlife Day, and until next time, auf Wiedersehen from the SDG Warriors.
Thank you so much.